Hello everyone and welcome to this video. I'm Fawad, and in this video I'm going to tell you something that you cannot find anywhere else. Then if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe to my channel right now. In this video we are going to run our application for the first time and do the SQL Server migration or Entity Framework migration. But I'm going to change your beliefs and your ideas about how migration works and how to use Entity Framework tools and Entity Framework design library. Then do not miss this video. Let's start with my librarian API. I have a controller, weather forecast controller and weather forecast.cs file. Let's sanitize our project and get rid of unnecessary files that I have here. I want to create one API controller and call it member controller. Let's do it here using add a controller. I want to create one API controller. Let's select API, empty API controller, and let's name it member controller. Good. The first thing that I need is to create one constructor. And because I'm using command query pattern and I'm using mediator to call my command handler and request handlers, I need to install mediator here as a dependency. Let's right click here on the dependencies and add mediator here. Now that I have it installed, let's inject iMediator and create a field for it. And now it is time to create my endpoint or my API action methods. I prepared them and I'm just pasting them here. Let me explain each of them one by one. First, we need to specify the HTTP verb for it. It is get, and here we are using mediator.send. We are sending the command that we have, which is get all members request. And the output of that is a list of member DTO. We are returning it. And because it is an async method, we need to type async here and return a task. And here we have another get method, but this get method has another signature because it is going to accept one ID. And this ID is from type int. Mediator is going to send a request and look for get member details request handler, but we are just passing the request name to the mediator. We registered the handlers and the request in our application layer, and we don't need to think about that because mediator is going to do the rest of the job for me. We have a post method, we have a put method, and we have a delete method. For post, we are accepting a create member request, send it to the mediator. And here, instead of returning OK and a result, we are just going to notify our client side or our consumer that something is created here. We are going to tell it that we created something with this ID. And then we are deleting and updating some members, and in return we are just returning no content. If something goes wrong, if an error happens in this process, we are going to get our users notified. In next video, we are going to talk about how to catch exceptions and how to present our exceptions in the best possible way to the end user and to the consumer. For now, do not think about that. The next thing that I need to have is to specify a connection string. And here inside the application setting, I can just easily paste the connection string that I have. Connection string, the name of my connection string is librarian connection string. The server is the local database. The database name is librarian DB. I am letting my Windows authentication to get connected to my SQL server using trusted connection equal true. And I want to let this connection string to have access to the connection string pool and execute more than one command at a time using this property or using this field by setting it to true. And now it is the time that I want to change your mindset about how to use Entity Framework design and Entity Framework tools. In almost all documentation and all videos, we are using just one project, one API project or MVC project. And in that project, we have one DB context. And migrating a project which the DB context and the startup project are in the same project is really easy. But here we have the startup project, which is my librarian API, and then I have this persistence layer and my DB context is placed here. how can I run it? The first thing that you may think that we need is to install Entity Framework tools and Entity Framework design for this API. But let's do it without that. Here I have a migration MD file. You can see that there are some commands that you need to run on your PowerShell or on your development console. I'm using PowerShell because I like it more. Here I am exactly in the address that I want inside the infrastructure folder and librarian.persistence, that I am here in the folder in the project that I have my DB context there. And now I want to just be sure that this .NET Tools Entity Framework is installed globally or not. I'm trying to run this command, and by running this command, it is going to show me an error that you have the latest version installed and you don't need to do anything else. But now I need to specify that I need to migrate my DB context and create the migration files. But before creating the migration files, how it is going to work? Let me go to the slides that I prepared for you. I have my domain layer and my domain models are there. And then I have the persistence layer, and inside the persistence layer, I have just my DB context. And we have this API layer. My API layer, let me switch to the laser pointer. And in the API layer, which is my startup application, I have my connection string and I have all the dependencies in my dependency injection. And the referencing between these projects is like that. The persistence layer has a code dependency to the domain layer, and API layer has one framework dependency to the persistent layer. In the first video, I explained about what is the difference between the framework dependency and code dependency. And these namings are something that I made up by myself to make this concept understandable to you. In this video, we are going to talk about that in more detail. Okay, we have this persistence layer. We are here and we just want to run the command. But for running the command, first, we need to specify what is our startup project, because my connection string and my service injections are here. Then entity framework behind the scene for running the migration starts with this startup application and looks for a registration for the DB context. And based on that registration, it is going to find this DB context and create the migration folder in the project that I have the DB context in it. And inside the DB context, I am pointing at the domain models, and domain models are exactly a mapping to the tables that I want to have inside the database. I haven't decorated any of my properties inside the domain model to be unique or for a specific length or for having identity ID, because domain model should be separated from the implementation that we have for the persistence layer. Imagine that in the future we are going to change the persistence layer and use just file storage, which is stupid, but you should imagine it. Then you shouldn't add any dependency to the domain model, which is for the persistence layer. Then all the database constraints for each of the properties of your domain model should be specified in your persistence layer. But before doing that, we need to run this migration. For running the migration, let's go back here and run the next command that I have. Here is my command. .NET Entity Framework Migration. Add a migration and call it init. And the startup project is in this path, which is I need to go up for 2 levels, for 2 folders, then API, then librarian API, then librarian API.cs project. We need to point to the CS project file. By running it, I will get an error, and this error will tell me that I need to install something on my startup project. Your startup project librarian.api doesn't reference to Microsoft.entity framework.design. This package is required for the entity framework core tools to work. But why I need to have entity framework design in my API project, if I add a dependency to entity framework design to my API, I have violated all clean architecture principles, because here I am writing down inside my API project a dependency which I need for my persistence layer, not for the API. And this API should be isolated and just do its own job. Now it is time to talk about the way that Visual Studio and .NET is supporting the dependencies. Here I have the persistence layer. Inside the persistence layer, I have some dependencies. Let's just focus on the project dependencies. If I open it, I will see that I have library and application, which is correct, because here I have just reference to one project, which is the application, but I can open it. If I open it, I can see that I have some references to AutoMapper, to Fluent Validation, Mediator, and Domain Model, which means that inside this persistence layer, without having Mediator installed or without having a connection to domains, I can use them. Let's try it. Let's try it by going to maybe my context and try to create a property just for being sure from the type iMediator. Yeah, I have access to iMediator, and if I go back to my persistent project CS project file, I haven't installed it. Let's go back here. Why? Because there is a chain of dependencies in the new .NET Core, or more specifically .NET applications. In .NET Framework, it was not like that until .NET 4.5. After that, I'm not sure because I haven't used it. I switched to .NET Core. But in .NET Core, if you have a dependency to a project, the dependencies for that project will be dependency for your project as well. And I like to call it framework dependency or something like that. I really don't have a name for it. Then let me just remove it and remove this one. And just to be sure, let's go back to my API project. Inside the API project, if I check the dependencies, inside the dependencies, I have project dependencies, and I'm pointing to the application project. Inside the application project, I have Mediator. Then I guess it is safe to assume that if I remove this dependency inside my API project to the Mediator, the code will still work. Let me go back to my controller, and here I can see that everything related to the Mediator is working because the dependencies to one of my dependencies is the direct dependency for my project. Okay, have it in mind. And now I want to talk about how to use Entity Framework Design and Entity Framework tools without specifying them inside this library and API. I guess the mystery is solved. You don't need to address them here. You just need to ignore the warning that the console gave you here inside this persistent layer, inside this persistent project. You just need to add a dependency, and it should be Microsoft Entity Framework Tools. Wait a minute. The console error told us that we need to have Microsoft Entity Framework core.design. And in almost all documentation and all videos, you will see that they are installing design and tools. But do we really need them? I'm not sure. Let's try it using Microsoft Entity Framework.tools. By installing it, it is going to ask me to add some dependencies. I have all dependencies here. And let me go back to the library and the persistent. I have Microsoft Entity Framework.tools installed. Have you ever been curious about what is this private asset? I'm going to explain it. Here, if I just expand the library and persistent dependencies, you will see that we have just Microsoft Entity Framework core.sql server inside my API. I told you all the dependencies for the persistence should be inside the API as well. But why this one is not there? Because these private assets, if I just comment this line and save the code, you will see that this one will be appear here. Then using this way, just adding the dependency related to your entity framework to your persistence layer and just commenting out these private assets, you can run your code without having a written dependency to your entity framework. Logically, you have a dependency, but it is not a written dependency. And now let's try to run the command without installing Microsoft.Entity Framework.Design, and let's uncomment this one and see what will happen. If I just run it like that, I will get another error because it really expects me to install this Microsoft.Entity Framework Design on the API project, but I don't want to do that. I just want to comment it out and run it again. Now you will see that we don't need to have Microsoft.Entity Framework.Design. It can easily create my migration folder inside my persistence layer without having any written dependency inside my API project. This is the CS proj file. You can see there is no dependency to Entity Framework Core, Entity Framework SQL Server, Entity Framework Design. It is the way that I usually use it because I don't want to pollute my CS proj file for the startup project just because of the migration. Now that I have the migrations here, I can just check them. Yes, I have everything here, and this is a snapshot of my tables. But here, as you can see, we don't have any kind of constraints for our fields. As an example here, the field created by, it just specified that the type is int. And as another example, this email, it just said it is required because it is not nullable, but it is specifying it as nvarchar max. But I don't want it to be a max. I don't want it to have a length of 50 or 60 or something. And as I told you, each layer should be responsible to validate its own data. But how to do that? You can go to the DB context. Let me close everything. Yeah, here. Entity Framework DB context has a method which is called onModelCreated. You can override it. Let's check it. It should be protected, override, and onModelCreating. Here it is my model creator. But before running this model creator, I want to specify some constraints for each of the fields that I have, each of the properties that I have for each of the tables. I can write my code here inside this method, or maybe I can create a file for each of the DB sets that I have separately and then call the files from here. I like the second approach because as you know me, I like to place all the files in a specific folder because of the findability and because clean architecture is like a guardrail which shows us where to put our files. Here inside the configuration, I like to have another item, and this item I'm going to call it member database initialization. And inside this member database initialization, I want to have one public configuration method, and it should be public and implement identity type configuration member, and this member should be from librarian.domain. And then I just need to implement this interface. We have one configure file, and in this configure file, we have a builder of type entity type builder members. I have some constraints registered here for each of the fields. As an example, I want the property that I have with the name first name be required and has a length of 50. I want to have exactly the same thing for my last name, email, and for phone number, it should be 12 because the length is 12. For postal code in the Netherlands, it should be 7 characters, 4 digits, 1 space, and 2 letters. And the birth of day should be required as well. The ID should be required and it should be identity column. And for creation date and modification date, created by and modified by, I want them to be required as well. But is it all I can do with this file? Of course not. We can use this configure method to send data to our application. But how to do that? We can just use this builder, and builder has a method called hasData. And here I can just pass an array of the items that I want to have. As an example, here I can create a new member, and this new member has some fields or some data. I prepared two members. Let me copy them from here and paste them here. It is exactly what I want, and another tab here maybe as well to make it more readable. I usually use a website, the fake name generator, and specify the gender, name set, and the country to create this information for me. As an example, if I click on generate, it is going to create a name for me with an address, with a postal code, with a phone number, and with email address. I'm just using them for seeding the data if I'm testing something. We have some libraries like Bogus to create the fake data, but it is more for testing the application, not for seeding the real data. And it is all. The only thing remains is that inside this onModel creation, let this model builder know that we have one configuration file. It works based on the reflection. I just need to notify this model builder that I have something which implemented iEntity model configuration, and it is going to look for all implementation of iEntity model configuration and run them here. Model builder apply configuration and pass it a type. Here I can just say assembly.get current assembly, or use type of librarian db context and assembly. It is showing me an error. It should be from assembly. Yeah, apply configuration from assembly. Now if I just check my migration, let me remove it and run the migration again. If I check it, now I will see that it is the same length. If it works. And now if I go to the migration folder, to the library db context model snapshot, I will see that I have some data for this member table, and the length here is 50, not max anymore. And easily I can just run the script for updating the database. You have the command here as well. You can just run it, and by running it, you can just open your SQL server and check if it is there or not. Let's try it. And if I just refresh it here, I can see that I have this librarian. And if I go to the members and just select the first 1,000 rows, you will see that I have 2 rows for John Doe and Sarah Smith with the phone numbers and with some informations here, exactly as I wanted. And now let's just run the application and see if I can use the controller. It runs it using the Swagger, and if I just try it out, I will see that I have 2 members, John Doe and Sarah Smith here, and I can get this information. Okay, it was all I prepared for this video. You learned how to use Entity Framework tool and not to use Entity Framework design. You realize that how this dependency chain is working and what is the best practice for using the migration without having any dependency to the Entity Framework in your API layer. If you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. And by hitting the bell, you will get notified every time that I upload a new video. Enjoy your life as a developer and do not forget to practice, because at the end of this tutorial, we are going to have a running application and you will be a senior developer.